I am on the grounds of the Harvard University, one of the most reputable universities in the whole world. What am I doing here, you may ask? I am here to speak to our one and only Professor Abiola Irele. Professor Abiola Irele is currently the Provost of Humanities, Management and Social Sciences at Kwara State University. But before he came to KWASU, he used to be a professor of French and comparative literature at Harvard University here in Boston. So what I've come to do is to speak to him in Boston to find out how his journey from Harvard here to KWASU in Malete in Ilorin began. So here is from Harvard to KWASU, Abiola Irele in motion. Come with me.
I was born in Ora, which is in Edo State. People call it Sabongida Ora, but in the local language it's called Eviobe. And it's in fact a multilingual community, both the Ora language, which is an Edo language, and Yoruba. Everybody practically in Ora speaks Yoruba. Anyway, at the age of 6 months, I was taken to Enugu because my father was a civil servant at Enugu, with the post office, with the Nigerian Postal Services. P&T it was called then. P&T, yes. And I grew up, my first 3 years, up to the age of 4, actually we lived in Enugu. And in fact, I began to speak Igbo. It was my first language, the first language that I really spoke, because of course the household around the city and everything was Igbo speaking. But of course, we left, came back to Lagos in 1940. I was 4 then, and I forgot all my Igbo and began to speak Yoruba, until 1944. You see, I was taken back to Ora and began to speak Ora again, but I didn't forget Yoruba. Then in 1945, I just spent a year in Ora, went to St. John's Primary School for a year, then came back to Lagos. By that time we were living in Idumagbo, because the family is Catholic, and I went to a Catholic school there, Idumagbo, St. Patrick's School in Idumagbo, which had only 4 years of primary and 4 years of primary 1, then standard 1 up to 4. And I couldn't, to make the transition to secondary school, I had to change school again. So I changed to St. Matthias in Obalende. I spent a year there and then entered St. Gregory's in Lagos. Growing up in Lagos was a very small city then. And very little traffic. You either walked, or you rode a bicycle. Regularly I rode, during the holidays, I would take a bicycle right to Yaba over Kata Bridge. That was the only bridge then. And there was no problem at all about it, What I'm trying to say is that it was a rather simple, straightforward kind of life, I'm sure there was poverty, but not the kind of in-your-face kind of poverty that you see today in Lagos. Or maybe I wasn't even aware of the inequalities and so on, in the way in which I am now, of the gross inequalities, of the neglect of the city and so on. Anyway, it was quite a nice childhood, I must say. Actually, I first went to Ibadan in 1955 to Nigerian College, which was on a campus next to Ibadan University, which was started, it was then University College Ibadan, to do my A-levels. I couldn't do the entrance exam direct to university because I didn't have a credit in mathematics. And that was the minimum to do even the entrance exam into Ibadan. So I had to go and do my A-levels, and I did the A-levels. This was then the London A-level. At the same time, Cambridge had created its own, special pre-university certificate. Anyway, the point is that I went up to Ibadan and I stayed those 2 years at the Nigerian College, which is now the Polytechnic, by the way. Anyway, and the two campuses were more or less, it was really porous. I mean, we went in and out. So I had all kinds of friends already at Ibadan University. Some of my friends till today, I first met them during that period, who went to Ibadan, and I was in the Nigerian College. And the transition to Ibadan, to the university, was just straightforward, normal. And I began my English degree in 1957. It was a three-year degree, and leisurely pace. That was the only subject we were doing. We didn't do minors or anything. It was English honors, something like 2 or 3 lectures a week for English, the literature, and 1 or 2 lectures a week in the language, because we did history of the English language and so on. Very leisurely, 3 years, extremely relaxed years. You did quite a lot of reading, and as I said later on, many years later, I was writing an introduction to J.P. Clark, and I said, we read English literature from Spencer to Spender. That was, at that time, Of course, it's been extended now. If you're going to start a syllabus in English, you will have to go beyond Spender because he was a poet of the 30s, So that was how I put it, Spencer to Spender. And the phrase had gone round, Ngugi uses it now and, says we don't want English to Spencer to Spender anymore. Anyway, the point, of course, again, is that while we had lots of time on our hands, and we could do all kinds of other things, and then we had this journal, which was The Horn, which J.P. Clark was editing, was the first editor, and then I took over from him in the second year. We had Dramatic Society, we had Music Society, we had all kinds of things. We even had a very special kind of club, which consisted in dining together, and brought a restaurant in from town to serve us. Anyway, this was the whole life of the elite. Information, we enjoyed ourselves tremendously, Went to dances, nightclubs, and so on. So that was it. It was the most enjoyable time. No strain, no sweat. They had this scheme in Ibadan where if you got an upper second or a first, you were sent automatically to do a PhD in England. And I was more or less like 2 others, destined for this. It just happened that in that year, some French Alliance Française man was sent to Ibadan to start French lessons. And it's a curious story. I had done O-level French on my own as a supplementary paper to my school set, and I passed it, I can tell you stories about when I did the exam, all the foolish things I put down, Anyway, I had some French. And this man was very, very nice. We listened to music together. I mean, as you all know, I'm a passionate lover of classical music. And we became very good friends. And he said, well, why don't you go to France? And he arranged it. He was an official of the French Ministry of Culture. And so I went to France. The first 2 years in Paris, I was doing language, And then I did a course which was called the professora. The professora, people were being trained to teach French as a foreign language, which meant that I had to take courses in literature, in language, in phonetics, and so on and so forth. Theoretical phonetics, actually. And the structure of French and so on. Before I then registered for my doctorate. I enjoyed myself so much, already began to enjoy myself so much in Paris. And especially I met the French African community. I met some of the writers already, and particularly the most influential person in this story is Alioune Diop, who ran a place called Présence Africaine, which was just down the road from where I lived. It was so approachable. Alioune Diop was basically a saint, Anyway, I wrote back to Ibadan to say, well, why should I go to England? Why don't I stay here and continue my French? The idea was to acquire enough French to use it for my PhD. But I said, why don't I just go on and so on, So University of Ibadan agreed that I should stay on, and I continued, and it was decided that I should do my PhD in France. So I registered for the PhD, I spent a total of 6 years in Paris. When I was leaving, I couldn't believe it myself that I had stayed so long. And I might as well say this, on one occasion, who came very often to Paris, by the way, when we met and talked, he said, look, Biola, you stayed here too long. Why don't you write up your thesis and go back home? And so I did. I began to write my thesis properly then, and finished it, and then defended it, and went back home. And I got this appointment in the University of Lagos, But then in the last 2 years, I had been given some kind of UNESCO fellowship, which meant that I was appointed to teach at in Lagos, but released on leave to finish my PhD, you see, part of the training program. Well, they never gave me the salary. They didn't, they said I should come to Lagos, come and do the interview with the civil service. I came and did it. The appointment never came, so I applied to the University of Lagos. Then they made a claim. They said, I had been given the fellowship by UNESCO, and I was meant to go and teach, at this, Advanced Teachers College in, Akoka, which is next to University of Lagos. So I came back, and the University of Lagos then, said, no, we can't appoint you because they didn't want to offend the government. So I said, okay, fine. So I applied to the University of Ghana. And I got a telegram saying, come over, giving me an appointment straight away. So I went. I went to Ghana. So I went to Ghana, and I stayed there 2 years before I came back to Nigeria. I actually came back to Nigeria in 1970, then to the University of Ife. I went to the Institute of African Studies, and Michael Crowder was then director. And I spent 2 very happy years there. Kiyuba was there too, and at Ibadan, at Ife. 2 very happy years, but my heart was in Ibadan. And as soon as there was a position at Ibadan, I applied and I got it. So I moved to Ibadan, And those were very great years at Ibadan, Whenever I think of those years from 1972 to 87 that I spent at Ibadan, on top, of course, with my earlier experience as a student, I think of Ibadan as a place that is extremely dear to me, It's run down terribly now. One of the best spots at Ibadan in those days was the staff club. It had a swimming pool, we sat together, we drank. It was not a beer parlor by any means. We talked, we had intellectual discussions. A lot of what I learned, about science, came from just speaking with my science colleagues, you know. Some of them also in the political science, suggested things I could read. And I read them, some in classics and some in philosophy. In fact, basically, it was Peter Baudurin, who was a professor of philosophy then, who really introduced me to philosophy properly. I had done some of that, through sociology. Sociology in France, is very philosophical. I mean, a lot of it, But, this interaction with these people at Ibadan, contributed immensely to one's development, So you drank, yes. And, the drinking is part of the culture, if you see what I mean. Now, to come to your question about how I got to go to the States, I was, as we say in Yoruba, I was sitting down quietly in my house in Ibadan when I got this letter from one of the professors at Ohio State University. His name was Richard Bjornson. Bjorn, B-J-O-R-N-S-O-N, I just got this letter out of the blue, saying that he had read my collection of essays, my first collection of essays, The African Experience in Literature and Ideology, and, more or less expressed admiration for it, and we got into correspondence. And then he said he would like me to come over as visiting professor at Ohio State. So I said, oh, why not? It's a good idea. So I accepted, and the idea was that I was going to go there for a year in 87, 88. So I went, and we got married just before I left, So we went together, n'est-ce pas? And so we went together, and then I stayed on because they said, oh, why don't you take on a job here? You see, so, and during that year I was interviewed for the job, And one of the factors really that also decided me on staying was that we were going to have a baby, our first child, who is now gone to college and she's now in New Jersey working. And the idea of going back with that baby, I wasn't too happy with it, So we decided it was better for us to stay on, So we stayed on, and that's how I got to stay on in the States, And I retired, in 2003, and got a job got an appointment at Stony Brook University of New York at Stony Brook. It is now called Stony Brook University, straightforward, to be director of African Studies. And I was passing, I had known Skip Gates for years, and in fact I spent a semester here as visiting professor at Harvard, And I was passing through, I went to a conference in Canada, in Quebec, and I was going back to Ohio. And I was passing through and I saw him, and I told him I was going to go to this place in Stony Brook, was moving there, leaving Ohio State. And he said, oh, why don't you come here? That's how it happened.
So you're credited to have written hundreds of essays. Most notable ones will be books like The African Experience in Literature and Ideology and The African Imagination. Will it be right to say your writing of these essays are greatly influenced and enhanced by your affinity for language?
Well, I've written in two languages, in English basically and in French. Some of my essays were in French, and took part in conferences, went to Dakar, for instance, and at a conference that Senghor had initiated, and he asked me to do, to compare negritude and African personality as political ideas, and I had to write it in French. Now, I mention that because I remember very well that, that essay, I wrote it very, very carefully. I mean, I wrote my thesis in French. You had to anyway. But I wrote that thesis, that essay, very, very carefully. Took more pains writing it, revised it. I think when you're writing, this is one of the things that we were taught at the University of Ibadan. You have to pay attention. And also this goes back to my school days anyway, in Lagos, in school. You wrote an essay, we wrote essays regularly, even though the teachers were Irish, they taught us English. I mean, Father Markandro was our English teacher. And going on to Ibadan later on, we wrote essays regularly, and in those days you wrote by hand, And let me say that has stayed with me, a certain care, for how you put things together, And I read student essays these days and I see that they just don't know how to put, words together, And by the time, even here at, in the US, I began teaching at Ohio State, I couldn't believe, the sloppiness of the writing, Even here at Harvard, when I was teaching at Harvard, we had to correct, do a lot of correcting, Don't think that people just come to Harvard all fully trained and full-blown, no, Anyway, one of the problems we now have in the university system in Nigeria is just the low level of writing, And that comes with people not even knowing the language, The command of English, has dropped considerably, But let me put it this way, The whole idea is not to be a stylist. One isn't writing fiction. The whole idea is to be as clear as possible.
Immediately I was named president of this university, which you call Vice Chancellor. Really, the first thing that came to my mind was to begin to interact with colleagues, scholars from around the world, to seek their opinion, to get their support, to begin to invite them to join with me. And even before I came to take over, to take over as Vice Chancellor. And it was in that process, and I will never forget this. In fact, specifically one day I was discussing with Ato Kwesi. Ato Kwesi is a major scholar of African literature, as you know. He's currently at the University of Toronto. I had invited him to my campus and we were discussing this, and that's how the idea that, who is the better person to have in that university than Irele? Here's a guy that even Harvard does not understand, do not value. They do value him, don't let me say do not. But, the way you feel, I felt, this is our Jewa. What are they doing with this man in Harvard? Let me just have this enormous individual and come back home and help.
I had known Nahala. When he was a student in Canada, he invited me over to give a keynote address at the university in Canada. I flew over there. So I had known him. And we met on a number of occasions, several times, since then. And so he was appointed Vice Chancellor, and he called me by phone and said, would I be interested in coming over as Provost?
And I know that instantly this will also raise, the status of a new university, just starting, having a person of the caliber of Irele. And so I called him up, and I said, Prof, this is what I've just been advised. You always say congratulations. I say thank you. But the reason I'm calling is to invite you to join with me at this university. And so we started discussing, and I was at Harvard for a program that summer. And it further gave me opportunity to sit down with him, with BJ, and others, and engage in very deep discussions of this. And it was back and forth negotiation with him that eventually, got a yes from him.
I said, well, yes, I wouldn't mind. I could come, Now, I also had a problem with people here, at Harvard, particularly in the French department, some of the students, in fact, the students, would tell you, you were teaching them an introduction to African studies. At the end of the year, they said this is not what they wanted to be taught. They knew what they wanted to be taught. One of the students, in French, wanted me to explain Césaire to them, a very difficult poet. Wasn't going to make the effort, Little problems like that, and I was beginning to get irritated. So I jumped at the chance.
I'm so proud of that. And he's a very dedicated person. He's a person that has brought a lot of knowledge, a lot of passion to KWASU. And I tell you, whatever KWASU has achieved today, in a very short time, is because we have a person of Abiola Irele.
I think one of the best things that has happened to a university such as Kwara State University is the fact that we have a person of the stature and experience of Professor Irele as our staff here, precisely as the Provost of Humanities.
Well, let me make it clear. I've lived in Europe, USA, I can compare, but I would like to return to Nigeria, to Africa, I've lived in Ghana. I enjoyed my stay in Ghana very much. And Ghana is doing very well right now, much better than Nigeria. I would love to see Nigeria flourish, so that we can all be there, be comfortable, within our skins, to be able to speak one's language on a daily basis, to be able to go out, and feel part of a community, And in any case, also to play a role in that community, however humble. It's very satisfying, except that, the stresses and so on are just, too many, But I would definitely prefer to be, to live in Nigeria, But it's very hard, It's been made very hard by all kinds of circumstances, So to sum up, I'm not asking for an ideal country. I'm just asking for a comfortable country.